I never thought a cardboard box could make that sound. That hollow thud when it hits the wall next to your head. I was standing in his office. My boss. 8 years I'd worked for him. 8 years of early mornings, late nights, missed birthdays, skipped vacations. And I was telling him I was pregnant. I thought he'd be happy. Or at least neutral. Professional. Instead, he stood up, looked at me like I'd just told him I committed a crime, and he said, "You're kidding." I said, "No, I'm 12 weeks. I wanted to tell you before I started showing." He laughed. Not a real laugh, a sharp one, mean. He said, Of course you do this now." I didn't understand. I said, "Do what?" He said, "Get pregnant, right when we're in the middle of the biggest quarter of the year." I felt my face get hot. I said, "I didn't plan it like that. It just happened." He said, "Nothing just happens. You made a choice, and now I have to deal with it." I said, "Deal with what? I'm not asking for special treatment. I'll work up until my due date. I'll..." He cut me off. He said, "You'll what? Take 3 months off? Maybe 6? Come back half committed, leave early for daycare pickups, call in sick every time the kid sniffles?" I stared at him. I said, "That's not fair." He said, "Fair? You want to talk about fair?" He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a file, threw it on the desk between us. He said, "You know what's not fair? Paying someone who's not even here." I looked at the file. It had my name on it. He said, "I don't pay for maternity leave. We're too small. Can't afford it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your things, and you're going to leave." And I couldn't process it. I said, "You're firing me?" He said, "I'm protecting my business." I said, "This is illegal." He smiled. Cold. He said, "Prove it." I stood there, frozen. My hands were shaking. I said, 8 years. I gave you 8 years. He said, "And I paid you for 8 years. We're even." I said, "No, we're not. I built half this company, the client retention program, the new vendor contracts, He picked up the box, the empty one, from the corner of his office, and he threw it. Not at me, but close enough. It hit the wall, knocked a frame off. Glass shattered. He said, "Pack your things. Now." I felt tears coming. Hot. Angry. I said, "You can't do this." He walked to the door, opened it, and said, "Watch me." Everyone in the office was staring. 20 people. Some I'd trained, some I'd hired, and they all just looked away. Like if they didn't make eye contact, it wasn't real. I walked to my desk. My legs felt numb. I pulled open the drawer. Pictures, pens, a coffee mug someone gave me for my birthday 3 years ago. I couldn't fit it all in my bag, so I left most of it. I took my phone charger, my laptop, a framed photo of me and my husband. That was it. He was standing by the door, arms crossed, watching, making sure I left. I walked past him, and he said, "Good luck finding another job in your condition." I stopped. I turned around, and I said, "You're going to regret this." He laughed. He said, "No, I don't think I will." I walked out, got in my car, and I sat there, in the parking lot, and I cried. Not because I was sad, because I was humiliated, because I'd given everything to that place, and the second I needed something, the second I became inconvenient, I was disposable. I looked at my phone, thought about calling my husband, but I couldn't. Not yet. Because saying it out loud would make it real. So I just sat there, watching people walk in and out of the building, like nothing happened. Like I was never there. I drove home. I don't remember the drive. I just remember pulling into the driveway, turning off the engine, and staring at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. She worked in accounting. It said, "I'm so sorry. I can't believe he did that." I didn't respond. What was I supposed to say? Another text from Michael in sales. He said that was messed up. If you need a reference, let me know. I wanted to scream, because where were they when it happened? Where were they when he threw the box? When he told me to leave? They just watched. They all just watched. I went inside. The house was empty. My husband was at work. Wouldn't be home for hours. I sat on the couch, put my hand on my stomach. Still flat. No bump yet. But she was in there, growing, depending on me, and I'd just lost everything. I thought about money. We had savings, but not much. Maybe 3 months, maybe 4 if we were careful. His salary covered the mortgage, barely, but we needed mine for everything else. Groceries, insurance, the car payment, and now we had a baby coming. Diapers, formula, childcare, doctor visits. I felt the panic rising, that tightness in my chest, that feeling like the walls were closing in. I grabbed my phone, Googled wrongful termination lawyers. The first 3 wanted retainers I couldn't afford. The fourth said they'd take the case on contingency, but it could take years. Years. I didn't have years. I had 7 months, maybe less. I put the phone down, and I thought, he wins. He gets to do whatever he wants, fire whoever he wants. And people like me, we just have to take it because we need the job more than they need us. I started crying again, harder this time, because I felt so stupid for trusting him, for believing that loyalty mattered, that hard work mattered. It didn't. None of it did. My phone rang. I almost didn't answer. A known number, but something made me pick up. I said, "Hello?" A woman's voice, professional, calm. She said, "Is this speaking?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My name is Catherine Wells. I'm the Chief Financial Officer. I need to speak with you." My heart dropped. I thought, he sent someone to threaten me, to make me sign something saying I won't sue. I said, "I don't want to talk to anyone from the company." She said, "I understand, but this is important. Please, just 5 minutes." I said, "Fine." She said, "Not over the phone. Can you come back to the office?" I laughed. It sounded bitter, even to me. I said, "You want me to come back? After what just happened?" She said, "I know how this sounds, but I promise, this is not what you think." I said, "Then what is it?" She paused, and she said, "The company was sold this morning, 9 a.m. The papers were signed an hour ago." I sat up. I said, "What?" She said, "Your former boss, he doesn't own the company anymore. He hasn't since this morning. And what he did to you, he had no authority to do it." I felt dizzy. I said, wait, so..." She said, "So you weren't fired, not legally, because he wasn't your boss anymore." I said, "But he told me to leave. She said, "I know, and we're handling it. but I need you to come in. We need to talk, face to face. I said, I don't understand. She said, I know, and I'll explain everything, but not like this. Can you be here in 30 minutes? I looked at the clock. I said, I guess. She said, thank you. Come to the main conference room, second floor. And she paused. She said, I'm sorry for what he did, for what you went through. We're going to make this right. She hung up, and I sat there, holding the phone, trying to process what she just said. He didn't own the company. The sale happened this morning, which meant when he fired me, he had no power, no authority. He was nothing. I changed clothes. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to feel like I had some control, some dignity. I put on the black blazer, the one I wore to important meetings, fixed my makeup, tried to hide the fact that I'd been crying for an hour. I drove back. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I kept replaying it, the way he smiled, the way he said, prove it, like he was untouchable. I parked in the same spot I'd left 30 minutes ago, walked through the same doors. Everyone stared, again. But this time it felt different. This time they looked confused, nervous. I went straight to the second floor. The conference room door was closed. I knocked. Catherine opened it. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, sharp suit, kind eyes. She said, thank you for coming. Please, sit. I sat. There were 2 other people in the room, a man in a gray suit, a woman with a laptop. Catherine said, this is Jonathan Reed. He's the new CEO. And this is Marie, our head of HR. Jonathan stood, shook my hand. He said, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. I said, me too. He sat back down. Catherine slid a folder across the table. She said, we need you to understand what happened today. I opened it. There were documents, sale agreements, transfer papers. She said, the acquisition was finalized at 9:02 this morning. Your termination happened at 9:47. I looked up. I said, so... She said, so he had no legal standing. The termination is void. Jonathan leaned forward. He said, we reviewed the security footage. We heard what he said, what he did, and I want you to know that is not how we operate. I said, okay. He said, we're offering you your position back, full reinstatement, same salary, same benefits, plus back pay for today. I stared at him. I said, just like that? Marie spoke for the first time. She said, just like that. Unless you don't want to come back, which we would understand after what you went through. I said, what about him? What happens to him? Catherine and Jonathan exchanged a look, and Catherine said, he doesn't know yet. I said, what do you mean he doesn't know? Jonathan said, the sale was confidential. Very few people knew. He wasn't one of them. Catherine said, we're telling department heads this afternoon, 3 p.m. He'll find out then. I said, so he thinks he still runs this place? Jonathan nodded. He said, for about 2 more hours, yes. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I said, and when he finds out, what happens? Marie said, he's being terminated, effective immediately, for cause. I said, for firing me? Catherine said, for that and other things. She opened another folder, slid it toward me. She said, we've been conducting an internal audit for weeks as part of the acquisition due diligence, and we found patterns. I looked at the papers, names, dates, women's names. I said, what is this? Marie said, over the last 6 years, 4 women left the company shortly after disclosing pregnancies. 2 filed complaints with HR. Both were dismissed. 1 was paid a settlement, small, with an NDA attached. I felt sick. I said, he's done this before? Catherine said, we believe so, yes. I said, and nobody stopped him? Jonathan said, the previous ownership structure was complicated. He had a lot of autonomy, a lot of protection, but that ends today. I looked at the names again. I recognized 2 of them. Jessica, she'd been in marketing. I thought she just quit. And Lauren, she'd trained me when I first started. I said, I didn't know. Marie said, Most people didn't. That's how he got away with it. I said, "What do you need from me?" Jonathan said, "We need you to decide. Do you want to come back or do you want to walk away? We'll support either choice." I said, "And if I come back?" Catherine said, "Then you walk in tomorrow morning, same desk, same team, and he won't be here." I said, "He'll know it was me, that I reported him." Marie said, "He can think whatever he wants. He can't touch you. Not anymore." I sat back. My head was spinning. I said, "Can I think about it?" Jonathan said, "Of course. Take tonight, call us tomorrow." "But—" He paused. I said, "What?" He said, "If you do come back, we'd like you to consider something else, a promotion." I said, "A promotion?" Jonathan said, "Your file is impressive. 8 years, consistently high performance, multiple commendations from clients. You rebuilt the vendor program from scratch, saved the company 6 figures annually." I said, "He never told me that." Catherine said, "We know. He took credit for most of your work." Jonathan said, "Which is another reason he's being terminated." I looked at them, at their faces, trying to find the catch, the trap. I said, "What kind of promotion?" Marie pulled out another document. She said, "Director of Client Relations, new position. We're restructuring the whole department. You'd oversee a team of 8. Full benefits, maternity leave, 12 weeks, paid." I felt my throat tighten. I said, 12 weeks? She said, "Yes, it's company policy. Has been for years. He just didn't tell people. Or he lied and said we couldn't afford it." Jonathan said, "We're not a small company anymore. We have the resources. We always did." I said, "So he just—" Catherine said, "He just didn't want to pay it." Yes. I put my hands on the table, tried to steady myself. I said, "If I take this, if I come back, what happens when people find out I was pregnant when he fired me? What happens when they realize that's why he's gone?" Jonathan said, "Let them realize it." Marie said, "You did nothing wrong. He did." Catherine said, "And if anyone has a problem with that, they can leave too." I looked at the document. Director of Client Relations. My name, printed right there, like it was already decided, like I'd already won. But I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt scared. I said, "I need to talk to my husband." Jonathan said, "Of course." Catherine stood. She said, "We'll need an answer by tomorrow, 10 a.m. I nodded, started to stand. Then I stopped. I said, "When you tell him, when you fire him, I want to be there." They all looked at each other. Jonathan said, "That's not standard protocol." I said, "I don't care. I want to see his face. I want him to know." Catherine said, "Know what?" I said, "That he didn't break me, that he lost, and I'm still here." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He said, 3 p.m., conference room B. We're meeting with all department heads. He'll be there. You can watch from the observation room. There's a one-way mirror." I said, "I want him to see me." Jonathan said, "I don't think that's a good idea." I said, "I don't care what you think is a good idea. I was the one he humiliated. I was the one he threw a box at. I deserve to look him in the eye." Marie said, "If he becomes aggressive." I said, "Then you'll handle it. That's what security is for, right?" Catherine smiled, small, barely there. She said, "You're tougher than I thought." I said, "I have to be." She nodded. She said, 3 p.m. tomorrow. Be here at 2:45. We'll get you set up." I left, walked back through the office. Everyone was still staring, but this time I didn't look away. I walked straight to my old desk. Someone had already cleaned it out, put my things in a box, shoved it under the desk like trash. I picked it up, carried it out, got back in my car, and I called my husband. He answered on the second ring. He said, "Hey, babe, how'd it go with the boss?" I said, "It's a long story." He said, "I've got time." So I told him. Everything. The firing, the box, the sale, the offer, the promotion. When I finished, he was silent. Then he said, "So what are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Do you want to go back?" I said, part of me does. Part of me wants to walk back in there and show him he didn't win. He said, and the other part? I said, the other part is terrified that it'll happen again, that someone else will decide I'm not worth keeping, that I'll spend my whole pregnancy waiting for the other shoe to drop. He said, you know what I think? I said, what? He said, I think you're the strongest person I know, and whatever you decide, I'm with you. I started crying again. He said, hey, it's okay. I said, I'm tired of crying. He said, then stop. Come home, we'll order pizza, watch something stupid, and tomorrow you'll know what to do. I said, how do you know? He said, because you always do. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the meeting, about his face, what he'd look like when they told him, if he'd be angry, shocked, scared. I wanted him to be scared. I wanted him to feel what I felt. That stomach drop moment when everything you thought was solid just disappears. My husband fell asleep around 11. I stayed up, pacing. I pulled out my laptop, started researching the new owners. Jonathan Reed, former VP at a tech company in Seattle, known for aggressive restructuring, high employee satisfaction ratings. Catherine Wells, MIT grad, 15 years in corporate finance, no scandals, no lawsuits. They seemed clean, legitimate, but so did he at first. When I started 8 years ago, he seemed great, funny, supportive. He bought lunch for the team every Friday, remembered birthdays, asked about my life. I thought I was lucky. I thought I'd found one of the good ones. But then I got promoted, started making more money, started getting attention from clients, and he changed. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe I just saw him clearly. He started taking credit for my ideas, interrupted me in meetings, made jokes about how I was too emotional, too sensitive. I told myself it was just his personality, that I was overreacting, but I wasn't. I was just trying to survive. At 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep, got up, made coffee. My husband found me at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. He said, "You look like hell." I said, "Thanks." He said, "Have you decided?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." He said, "And?" I said, "I'm going back." He nodded. He said, "Good." I said, "And I'm taking the promotion." He smiled. He said, "Even better." I said, "And I'm going to that meeting. I'm going to watch him lose everything, just like he tried to make me lose everything." He came over, kissed the top of my head. He said, "That's my girl." I called Catherine at 8. She answered immediately. I said, "It's me." She said, "And?" I said, "I'm in. I'm taking the position." She said, "I'm glad." I said, "And I want to be in the room, not behind glass, in the room." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay, I'll make it happen. 2:45. Don't be late." I got there at 2:30, early. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, just breathing, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. At 2:40, I walked in. Catherine met me in the lobby. She said, "You ready?" I said, "No, but I'm doing it anyway." She said, "Fair enough." We took the elevator to the second floor. She led me to a small office, said, "Wait here, I'll come get you when it's time." I said, "Is he here yet?" She said, "Yes, he's in his office. Thinks he's attending a standard leadership update." I said, "Does he seem nervous?" She said, "No, he seems annoyed that we're interrupting his day." I felt my jaw tighten. She said, "You don't have to do this. You can watch from outside or not watch at all." I said, "I have to." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because if I don't, I'll always wonder if I could have, if I was strong enough." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're already strong enough. You proved that by coming back." I didn't know what to say to that. She left. I sat in the office, watched the clock. 2:50, 2:55. At 2:58, the door opened. Marie stepped in. She said, "It's time." I stood up, smoothed my blazer, followed her down the hall. We stopped outside conference room B. I could hear voices inside. His voice, loud, complaining about something. Marie said, "He doesn't know you're coming." I said, "Good." She opened the door. I walked in. There were 8 people around the table, department heads, and him, sitting at the far end. He saw me. His face went white, then red. He said, "What is she doing here?" Jonathan was at the head of the table. He said, "She works here." He said, "I fired her." Jonathan said, "No, you didn't, because you don't have that authority." He stood up. He said, "What are you talking about? I've been running this company for 10 years. I have all the authority." Catherine said, "Had. You had authority. Past tense." He looked around the table, like he was waiting for someone to agree with him. No one did. He said, "This is ridiculous. I'm calling legal." Jonathan said, "Go ahead. They work for me now, not you." And that's when I saw it. The moment it clicked, the realization washing over his face. He said, "What?" Catherine slid a document across the table. She said, "The company was sold yesterday at 9 a.m. You are no longer the owner, no longer the CEO. As of this moment, you are terminated." He didn't move, just stared at the paper, like if he looked long enough, it would change. He said, "You can't do this." Jonathan said, "It's already done." He said, "I built this company from nothing. Catherine cut him off. She said, "You inherited this company from your father 12 years ago, and you've been running it into the ground ever since." He said, "That's not true." Marie opened her laptop, turned it toward him. She said, "Revenue down 18% over 3 years, client retention at an all-time low, employee turnover rate triple the industry average. You want me to keep going?" He pushed the laptop away. He said, "This is about her, isn't it?" He pointed at me. He said, "She went crying to you, played the victim, and you bought it." I felt my face get hot, but I didn't look away. Jonathan said, "This has nothing to do with her. This is about your performance, your conduct, your pattern of illegal terminations." He said, "Illegal? I didn't do anything illegal." Catherine pulled out another folder. She said, "Jessica Monroe, fired 3 weeks after announcing her pregnancy. Lauren Chen, forced to resign after requesting maternity leave. Stephanie Ruiz, paid off with an NDA after you told her she was a liability. Should I continue?" He said, "Those were business decisions." Marie said, "Discrimination is not a business decision, it's a crime." He laughed, but it sounded wrong, desperate. He said, "Good luck proving it." Jonathan said, "We don't have to. You recorded yourself." He said, "What?" Marie turned the laptop again, pressed play, and I heard it. His voice, from yesterday. "You made a choice, and now I have to deal with it." Then my voice, small, shaking, "That's not fair." Then him again. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? I don't pay for maternity leave. We're too small. Can't afford it." The recording stopped. He said, "That's illegal. You can't record me without consent." Catherine said, "Actually, the employee handbook you signed clearly states all office communications may be monitored for quality assurance. You agreed to it." He said, "I never—" She said, "Page 43, paragraph 2. He went quiet. His face was red, sweating. He looked at me, really looked at me, and he said, "You set me up." I said, "No, I didn't have to. You did this yourself." He stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, loud. He said, "You're all going to regret this." Jonathan said, "Sit down." He said, "No, I'm leaving, and I'm calling my lawyer, and when I'm done with you—" Catherine said, "You signed a non-compete and a non-disparagement clause. You breach either one, we own you." He said, "I don't care." Jonathan said, "You should, because we're not just terminating you, we're filing a formal complaint with the labor board for every woman you illegally fired, every harassment claim you buried, every NDA you forced someone to sign." He went pale. He said, "You can't." Marie said, We already did, this morning at 8 a.m. He looked around the table at the other department heads, people who'd worked under him for years. He said, "You're just going to sit there? You're going to let them do this?" No one answered. He said, "I gave you jobs. I promoted you. I—" One of them spoke, Greg, head of sales. He said, "You promoted us because we kept our mouths shut, because we didn't ask questions. But we saw what you did, and we said nothing, and I'm ashamed of that." Another voice, Rebecca, head of marketing, she said, "I watched you humiliate people, fire people, destroy people, and I told myself it wasn't my problem, but it was." He said, "You're all cowards." Jonathan said, "Security will escort you out. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Anything else stays." He said, "This is my company." Jonathan said, "It was your company. Now it's mine. And the first thing I'm doing is erasing every trace of you." 2 security guards came in, stood on either side of him. He didn't resist, just stared at me, and he said, "I hope you're happy." I said, "I'm not." He said, "What?" I said, "I'm not happy. I'm relieved. There's a difference." He shook his head. He said, "You'll never make it without me. This place will fall apart." I said, "Maybe, but at least we'll fall apart with dignity." They walked him out. The whole table sat in silence, listening to his footsteps fade, then the elevator ding, then nothing. Jonathan looked at me. He said, "You okay?" I said, "Ask me tomorrow." The room emptied slowly. People filed out. Quiet. Some of them looked at me, nodded. Others avoided eye contact, like they were ashamed. Greg stopped at the door. He said, "I'm sorry for not saying something." I said, "It's okay." He said, "No, it's not. But thank you for being braver than the rest of us." He left. Catherine stayed. So did Marie. Catherine said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Numb." Marie said, "That's normal." I said, "Is it? Because I thought I'd feel, I don't know, victorious, satisfied, but I just feel empty." Catherine said, "You went through something traumatic, twice. Once when he fired you, and again just now, watching him lose everything. That's a lot to process." I said, "He looked so small at the end." She said, "Bullies always do when you take away their power." Marie said, "We're going to need you to give a formal statement for the labor board investigation." I said, "When?" She said, "Next week, whenever you're ready." I said, "Will the other women have to testify too?" Marie said, "Only if they want to. Some of them already have." I said, "Jessica?" She nodded. She said, "And Lauren, and 2 others we didn't know about. They came forward after we started asking questions." I felt my chest tighten. I said, "How many?" Marie said, "Total 6 that we know of, maybe more." I said, 6 women, and nobody stopped him?" Catherine said, "The previous ownership didn't want to. They were friends, college roommates. They protected each other." I said, "And now?" She said, "And now they're facing their own consequences. Civil suits, possible criminal charges for covering it up." I sat down, put my head in my hands. I said, "I just wanted my job back. I didn't want all of this." Catherine sat next to me. She said, "I know, but sometimes doing the right thing means more than just fixing your own situation. It means fixing the system so it doesn't happen to someone else." I looked up. I said, "Do you really think it won't happen again?" She said, "I don't know, but at least now people will think twice." I said, "Because they're scared of getting caught?" She said, "I'll take scared over confident any day." I started the new position on Monday. Director of Client Relations. My own office, window view. A desk that didn't wobble. My team was waiting when I arrived. 8 people. Some I knew, some I didn't. They looked nervous. I didn't blame them. I said, "Good morning." A few mumbled it back. I said, "I know this is weird. I know what happened. And I know some of you probably worked closely with him. So if you need time to process, I get it." A woman in the back spoke up. Amanda. She'd been there 3 years. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Did he really throw a box at you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I knew it. I knew he was capable of that. But I never—" She stopped. I said, "What?" She said, "I never said anything because I needed this job." I said, "I understand." She said, "No, you don't. I saw him make you cry once, in the break room, 2 years ago. He'd yelled at you about a report, and you just took it, and I walked away." I said, "It's okay." She said, "It's not, but thank you for not walking away this time." Another voice, Marcus, older guy, quiet. He said, "What do you need from us?" I said, "Honestly, I need you to trust me. I know that's asking a lot, but I can't do this alone." Marcus said, "What if we can't, yet?" I said, "Then we'll work on it, day by day." They seemed to relax, a little. I said, "Okay, let's get to work." We spent the morning going through accounts, clients we were losing, contracts that were about to expire. By lunch, I realized it was worse than I thought. He'd been ignoring problems for months, maybe years, letting relationships fall apart, blaming other people when things went wrong. I called Catherine. I said, "We have a problem." She said, "How bad?" I said, "We're about to lose our 3 biggest clients." She said, "Can you save them?" I said, "Maybe, if I move fast." She said, "Then move. Do whatever you need." I hung up, looked at my team. I said, "Who wants to help me save this company?" All 8 hands went up. We worked until midnight, calling clients, apologizing, explaining the transition, promising things would be different. Some hung up, some listened. One said, "I'm only giving you a chance because you're not him." 3 weeks in, I was exhausted, pregnant, running a department, trying to prove I deserved the promotion. My husband said I was doing too much. I said I didn't have a choice. He said, "You always have a choice." I said, "Not if I want to keep this job." He said, "They're not going to fire you." I said, "You don't know that." He said, "Yes, I do, because you're good at this, better than he ever was." I wanted to believe him, but every day I walked in, I expected someone to tell me I wasn't cutting it, that they'd made a mistake, that I should step down. It never came. Instead, Catherine called me into her office. She said, "Close the door." I did. My stomach dropped. I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Nothing. I just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up." I said, "I'm fine." She gave me a look. She said, "Try again." I said, "I'm tired, scared, waiting for someone to realize I don't know what I'm doing." She said, "You know exactly what you're doing. You saved 2 of those 3 accounts. The third one, they were leaving no matter what. That's not on you." I said, "It feels like it is." She said, "That's imposter syndrome, and it's normal, especially for women in leadership, especially after what you've been through." I said, "How do I make it stop?" She said, "You don't. You just keep going anyway." I nodded. She said, "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about." I said, "Okay." She said, "We've been getting calls from other women, women who used to work here, women who left because of him." I said, "And?" She said, "And they want to join the complaint, officially. There are 11 now." I felt my breath catch. I said, "11?" She said, "Yes, and they're asking if you'd be willing to speak, publicly, at a press conference, with the lawyers." I said, "Why me?" She said, "Because you're the one who stayed. You're the one who fought back. You're the face of this." I said, I don't want to be the face of this. She said, I know, but they need someone who can show them it's worth it, that they're not alone. I said, no. Catherine said, just think about it. I said, I don't need to think about it. I'm not doing it. She said, why not? I said, because I'm barely holding it together as it is. I have a baby coming, a job I'm terrified of losing, a husband who thinks I'm working myself to death. I can't add this. She said, these women need you. I said, they don't need me. They need a lawyer, a system that works, not some pregnant woman who got lucky. She said, you didn't get lucky. You fought. I said, I survived. There's a difference. She leaned back. She said, okay, I won't push, but the offer stands if you change your mind. I left her office, went back to mine, closed the door, sat at my desk, and I thought about those 11 women, where they were now, what they were doing, if they thought about him, if they still felt small. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. It said, my name's Lauren. I worked at the company 5 years ago. I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to him. I'm one of the 11, and I'm not scared anymore. I stared at the message, typed back. I said, you're welcome. She said, can I ask you something? I said, sure. She said, how did you do it? How did you walk back in there after he tried to destroy you? I said, I didn't have a choice. She said, yes, you did. You could have walked away, taken a settlement, disappeared, but you didn't. I said, I couldn't. She said, why not? I sat there, trying to find the words, and I said, because I didn't want my daughter to grow up thinking that's how the world works, that powerful men get to do whatever they want, and women just have to take it. She said, so you did it for her? I said, no, I did it for me. She gets to benefit from it. That's different. She said, you're braver than you think. I said, I don't feel brave. She said, none of us do, but we're doing it anyway. That's what makes it count. The press conference was scheduled for Friday. I didn't agree to go, but I showed up anyway. The lawyer's office, downtown, 15th floor. There were cameras outside, news vans, reporters. I almost turned around, but then I saw them, the other women, standing in a group near the entrance, 11 of them. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Lauren saw me first. She walked over. She said, you came. I said, I don't know why. She said, yes, you do. We went inside, up the elevator, into a conference room. The lawyer was there. Patricia something. Sharp suit, no-nonsense energy. She said, thank you all for coming. This won't be easy, but it's necessary. She explained the process, how it would work, who would speak, what they could and couldn't say. Then she looked at me. She said, we'd like you to go first. I said, why? She said, because you're still there, still working. You're proof that fighting back doesn't mean losing everything. I said, I almost did lose everything. She said, but you didn't, and that matters. I looked at the other women. They were watching me, waiting. I said, what do I say? Patricia said, the truth, what he did, how it felt, why you're here. I said, what if I mess it up? One of the women spoke. Jessica, the one from marketing. She said, you won't. I said, how do you know? She said, because you're not doing this for you. You're doing this for all of us. At 2 p.m., we walked out, into a room full of cameras, microphones, flashing lights. Patricia went first, laid out the case, the pattern, the evidence, the 11 women. Then she said, and now I'd like to introduce someone who's been at the center of this, someone who refused to stay silent. I stepped up to the podium. My hands were shaking. I looked at the cameras, at the reporters, at the women standing behind me, and I said, my name is... I stopped, took a breath, started again. I said, my name doesn't matter. What matters is what happened and what we're going to do about it. I told them everything. The box, the firing, the humiliation, the way he smiled when he said, prove it. I told them about the phone call, the sale, the reinstatement, the recording, the other women. When I finished, the room was silent. Then the questions started. A reporter in the front, young guy, he said, "Do you think this will change anything?" I said, "I don't know, but doing nothing definitely won't." Another one, woman, older, she said, "Are you afraid of retaliation?" I said, "Every day, but I'm more afraid of staying quiet." Another, he said, "What do you want to happen to him?" I paused. I said, "I want him to understand what he did. I want him to feel what we felt, but mostly, I just want him to never be able to do this again." The questions kept coming for 30 minutes. Then Patricia stepped in. She said, "That's all for today. Thank you." We filed out, back into the conference room. The women surrounded me, hugging me, thanking me. Lauren said, "You were amazing." Jessica said, "You didn't mess up once." I said, "I felt like I was going to throw up the whole time." She said, "We all did, but you didn't show it." Patricia pulled me aside. She said, "The response is going to be big. Are you ready for that?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. That means you're honest." My phone started buzzing. Texts, emails, calls. Some supportive, some not. One message said, "You're a liar. You're just trying to get money." Another said, "Women like you ruin men's lives." I showed Patricia. She said, "Block them. Don't engage." I said, "How many more are there going to be?" She said, "A lot. People don't like it when women fight back." I said, "Great." She said, "But for every hateful message, there will be 10 from women who needed to hear this, who needed to know they're not alone." I said, "Does it get easier?" She said, "No, but it gets worth it." I went home. My husband was waiting. He'd watched the press conference, live streamed it. He said, "I'm proud of you." I said, "I'm exhausted." He said, "I know. Come here." He held me, and I cried. Not sad crying, just release. He said, "You did good today." I said, "Did I?" He said, "You gave 11 women their voices back. Yeah, you did good." The story went viral. By Monday morning, it was everywhere. National news, social media, think pieces. Some people called me brave. Some called me a hero. Others called me worse things, things I won't repeat. The company released a statement, supporting the women, condemning the behavior, promising systemic change. Jonathan did an interview, said he was horrified, said this would never happen again under his leadership. I watched it from my office. It felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else. My team rallied around me, brought me coffee, covered meetings when I needed a break. Amanda said half the internet is in love with you. I said, and the other half wants me dead. She said, ignore them. I said, easier said than done. Marcus knocked on my door. He said, someone's here to see you. I said, who? He said, him. My blood went cold. I said, what? Marcus said, he's downstairs, in the lobby. Security won't let him up, but he's asking for you. I said, tell him to leave. Marcus said, they already did, he won't. I stood up, walked to the window, looked down, and there he was, standing on the sidewalk, staring up at the building. I called security. I said, I want him removed. They said, we've asked. He says he'll leave when you talk to him. I said, I'm not talking to him. They said, then we'll call the police. I said, do it. 10 minutes later, cop cars. They escorted him away, but not before he looked up one more time. And even from 15 floors up, I could see his face. He looked broken. I should have felt satisfaction, victory, but I just felt tired. Catherine called. She said, I heard what happened. Are you okay? I said, I don't know. She said, do you want to go home? Take the rest of the day? I said, no. If I leave, he wins. She said, he's already lost. I said, then why does it still feel like he's everywhere? She didn't have an answer for that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Again, I kept thinking about his face, the way he looked standing there, and I wondered, did he regret it? Did he understand? Or did he just feel sorry for himself? A letter came, 3 days later, hand-delivered to the office. My name on the envelope, his handwriting. Security brought it to me, asked if they wanted to open it first. I said, no, I'll do it. I waited until I was alone, opened it. Inside, 2 pages, handwritten. It started, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me." You're right. I read it anyway. He said he was sorry, that he didn't realize, that he was under a lot of pressure, that he made mistakes. He said he lost everything: his job, his reputation, his marriage. His wife left him when she found out, took the kids. He said he was seeing a therapist now, trying to understand why he did what he did. He said he hoped someday I could forgive him. The letter ended, "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." I put it down, stared at it, and I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just emptiness. I showed it to my husband that night. He read it, then he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "You're not going to respond?" I said, "What would I say?" He makes it sound like it was a mistake, like he just forgot to be a decent human being. He said maybe he believes that. I said, "That's the problem. He doesn't get it. He thinks saying sorry fixes it, that going to therapy means he's changed, but he hasn't. He's just scared. Scared of what people think, scared of being alone. He's not sorry for what he did, he's sorry he got caught." My husband said, "So throw it away." I said, "I can't." He said, "Why not?" I said, Because what if he's telling the truth? What if he really does understand now?" My husband looked at me. He said, "Do you hear yourself?" I said, "What?" He said, "You're doing it again, making excuses for him, trying to see his side even after everything." I said, "I'm not making excuses." He said, "Yes, you are, because that's what you do. You see the best in people even when they show you the worst." I said, "Is that a bad thing?" He said, "Not usually, but with him, yeah, it is." I looked at the letter again, and I thought, he's right. I folded it, put it back in the envelope, and I put it in my desk drawer, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I wasn't ready to let it go. 4 months later, I was showing, really showing. Couldn't hide it anymore. People noticed, asked when I was due, if I was excited, if I had names picked out. I smiled, said yes, said soon, said we're still deciding. But the truth was, I was terrified. Not about the baby, about what came after. Maternity leave, 12 weeks, paid, the thing he told me didn't exist. I kept waiting for someone to take it away, to say there was a mistake, that I didn't qualify. But Catherine assured me, over and over, "It's yours. You've earned it." The case moved forward, slowly. Lawyers, depositions, paperwork. The 11 women became 15, then 26, then 27. Each one with a story, each one he'd destroyed. Some of them reached out to me, said thank you, said they couldn't have done it without me. I didn't know what to say to that because I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who got lucky, who happened to be in the right place with the right people, who believed me. One afternoon, Jonathan called me into his office. He said, "Sit." I did. He said, "I have a question, and I need you to be honest." I said, "Okay." He said, "Do you still trust us?" I blinked. I said, "What?" He said, "This company, me, Catherine, do you trust that we won't do to you what he did?" I said, "I don't know." He nodded. He said, "I appreciate the honesty." I said, "Why are you asking?" He said, "Because we want to offer you something, and I need to know you'll actually consider it, not just say yes because you're afraid to say no." I said, "What is it?" He slid a folder across the desk. I opened it. Inside, a contract. Vice President of Client Relations. I looked up. I said, "What?" He said, "You've turned the department around. In 6 months, client retention is up 30%. Revenue is up 20. You've hired 4 new people, trained them, built a team that actually functions." I said, "I was just doing my job." He said, no, you were doing his job and yours, and you did it better than he ever could. I said, I'm about to go on maternity leave. He said, I know, and when you come back, this position will be waiting. I said, why? He said, because you've earned it, and because I want you to know this company values you, not just your work, you. I said, I need to think about it. He said, take all the time you need. I took the folder, went back to my office, closed the door, sat at my desk, and I stared at the title, Vice President. 6 months ago, I was fired, humiliated, told I was a liability, and now I was being offered this. I called my husband. I said, you're not going to believe this. He said, try me. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, do you want it? I said, I don't know. He said, that's not an answer. I said, I'm scared. He said, of what? I said, of failing, of taking it and proving him right, that I can't handle it, that I'm not good enough. He said, who? I said, him, my old boss. What if he was right? What if I'm only here because they feel guilty? What if... He cut me off. He said, stop. I said, what? He said, stop letting him live in your head. He's gone. He lost. You won. And you keep acting like you don't deserve it. I said, because maybe I don't. He said, says who? I said, says me. He said, well, you're wrong, and I'm tired of watching you shrink yourself because some insecure man made you feel small. You are good at this. You are worth this. And if you don't take it, you're letting him win. I didn't say anything. He said, I love you, but I need you to love yourself, enough to believe you deserve good things. I hung up, sat there, thinking. Then I opened my desk drawer, pulled out the letter, the one from him. I read it again, all the apologies, all the excuses, and I realized I'd been holding on to it, waiting for it to mean something, waiting for him to give me permission to move on. But he couldn't, because this was never about him. It was about me. I took the letter, walked to the shredder, and I fed it through, watched it turn into strips, into nothing. Then I went back to Jonathan's office, knocked. He said, come in. I said, I'll take it. He smiled. He said, good. I said, but I have conditions. He said, name them. I said, maternity leave, full 12 weeks, no calls, no emails, no check-ins. He said, done. I said, and when I come back, I want to start a mentorship program for women in the company so they know their rights, so they know what to do if someone treats them the way he treated me. He said, I love that. Consider it approved. I said, and one more thing. He said, what? I said, I want his name removed from everything, the awards, the plaques, the donor wall. I don't want any trace of him left. He said, already done. We scrubbed it last month. I went on leave 2 weeks later. My last day. The team threw me a small party. Cake, balloons, a onesie that said Future VP. Amanda gave a speech. She said, 6 months ago, we didn't know if this department would survive. We didn't know if we'd have jobs. And then you showed up and you didn't just save us. You showed us what leadership actually looks like. Everyone clapped. I cried. Hormones, probably. Marcus handed me a card, signed by everyone. It said, thank you for fighting, not just for yourself, for all of us. I hugged them, one by one, told them I'd see them in 12 weeks, told them not to burn the place down. They laughed, promised nothing. I drove home. My husband had set up the nursery. Crib, changing table, rocking chair, everything ready. I stood in the doorway, looking at it, and for the first time in months, I felt calm. My daughter was born 3 weeks later, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, perfect. I named her after my mother, Grace, because that's what I wanted for her. Grace, to move through the world without shrinking, without apologizing for existing. My husband cried when he held her. He said, "She looks like you." I said, "Poor thing." He said, "No, lucky thing." The 12 weeks went by fast, too fast. Sleepless nights, endless diapers, feeding every 2 hours, but also quiet moments, rocking her, watching her sleep, feeling her tiny hand wrap around my finger. I didn't think about work, didn't check email, didn't wonder what was happening. For the first time in years, I just existed. But eventually, the 12 weeks ended, and it was time to go back. I was terrified that I'd forgotten how to do the job, that they'd replaced me, that Grace would forget me while I was gone. My husband said, "She won't forget you. You're her mom." I said, "What if I'm bad at both, at being a mom and a VP?" He said, "Then you'll figure it out, like you always do." My first day back, I walked into the building, took the elevator to my floor, and when the doors opened, there was a banner, "Welcome back, VP." The team was waiting, clapping. Amanda handed me a coffee. She said, "Decaf, because I know you're still nursing." I almost cried again. Jonathan came out of his office. He said, "Good to have you back." I said, "Good to be back." And I meant it. 6 months after I came back, the verdict came in. The labor board ruled in favor of all 26 of us. Fines, penalties, a permanent record that would follow him, make it nearly impossible for him to work in management again. Patricia called me. She said, "We won." I said, "I heard." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Tired." She said, "Not victorious?" I said, "No, because winning doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't give those women back the years they lost, the careers they gave up, the confidence he destroyed." She said, "No, but it might stop him from doing it to someone else." I said, "Might?" She said, "It's the best we can do." The settlement came next. Money, split between all 26 of us. It wasn't life-changing, but it was something. I put mine in a college fund for Grace, so she'd never have to choose between her career and her dignity, because she couldn't afford to fight. I ran into him once, a year later, at a coffee shop downtown. I was in line, holding Grace, and I heard his voice behind me, ordering the same drink he always got, black coffee, 2 sugars. I froze, considered leaving, but then I thought, no, I'm not running anymore. I turned around. He saw me, saw Grace. His face went pale. I said, "Hello?" He said, "Hi." We stood there, awkward silence. Then he said, "She's beautiful." I said, "Thank you." He said, "How old?" I said, 18 months. He nodded, looked away. He said, "I heard about the promotion. Congratulations." I said, "Thanks." He said, "I'm working at a call center now, customer service. It's all I could get." I didn't know what to say to that. He said, "I think about it sometimes, what I did, how different things could have been." I said, "Do you?" He said, "Yeah, every day." I said, "Good." He looked at me. He said, "I really am sorry. You know that, right?" I said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "Does it matter?" I said, "No, not really." He nodded. He said, "I deserve that." His coffee came up. He grabbed it, started to leave. Then he stopped. He said, "For what it's worth, you were always the best person in that building. I should have seen it." I said, "You did see it. You just didn't care." He didn't argue, just walked out. And I watched him go, this man who'd taken up so much space in my head, who'd made me question everything about myself. And he looked small, ordinary, powerless. Just a man, nothing more. It's been 3 years since that morning in his office. 3 years since the box hit the wall. 3 years since I thought my life was over. Grace is almost 4 now. She's loud, fearless, asks a million questions a day. Why is the sky blue? Where do birds sleep? Why do you have to go to work? I tell her, because Mama has a job, an important one. She says, "What do you do?" I say, "I help people. I make sure they're treated fairly." She says, "Like a superhero?" I say, "Something like that." The mentorship program I started, it's grown. 30 women now, meeting once a month, talking about their rights, their worth, how to stand up when someone tries to tear them down. Some of them have their own stories, their own battles, and I listen. I help where I can. Sometimes I think about him. Not often, but sometimes. I wonder if he really changed, if therapy helped, if he understands now what he took from us, or if he just feels sorry for himself. I'll never know, and I've made peace with that, because this story, it's not about him anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. It's about the 26 women who found their voices. It's about the company that chose to do better. It's about Grace growing up in a world where maybe, just maybe, she won't have to fight as hard as I did. Last week, she asked me why I have a picture on my desk of me and a bunch of women she doesn't know. I said, "Those are my friends, women who went through something hard and came out stronger." She said, "Were you scared?" I said, "Yes, every day." She said, "But you did it anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's very brave, Mama." And I thought, maybe it was. Maybe I was braver than I knew. So, if you're listening to this, if you're in a moment where someone made you feel worthless, where someone told you you were too much, too emotional, too demanding, I need you to hear this. You are not the problem. They are. And you deserve better. You deserve a workplace that values you, a boss who respects you, a life where you don't have to choose between your career and your humanity. And if you're not getting that, fight. Document everything, find your people, use your voice, because the system is broken, but it only stays broken if we stay silent. I didn't stay silent, and yeah, it cost me sleep, peace, months of my life I'll never get back, but it also gave me something: power, not over him, over myself. The power to know my worth, to demand better, to build something new. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about women who fought back, who rebuilt, who refused to disappear, then stay close. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because there are more stories to tell, more battles to fight, more voices that need to be heard. And I'm not done yet. None of us are. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me what you're fighting for, because you're not alone. Even when it feels like the whole world is against you, we're here and we're listening. I'll see you in the next one. Stay strong.